Hi, welcome to the CIDCI online Salon series. I'm Margie O'Driscoll, and on behalf of the CIDCI Board of Directors, I'd like to welcome you here today. CIDCI is a not-for-profit organization that relies on your financial support to provide these programs. Thank you to our sponsors who make all of this possible. Over the last few months, CIDCI's hardworking Board of Directors has refined our mission statement and values. This is what we believe. CIDCI is a catalyst to improve the built environment and inspire innovation. Our mission is to facilitate the exchange of ideas, knowledge, and insights to address challenges and opportunities in this industry. We strive to accelerate creativity and the awareness of new ideas. We seek diverse voices to create better outcomes for all. We adhere to a moral ethos with sensitivity to all beings, and we are resilient and focus on meaningful impact. CIDCI recently concluded our annual Fall Forum. Over 5 days, we explored the possible history of the future, the role that failure plays in innovation, startups changing the world, and more. In case you missed it, all of these events were recorded and are available both on the CIDCI website and YouTube. Over the last few weeks, we've been hearing a lot about supply chain problems and the role of container ships in moving goods. Today, we will explore a slightly different subject, but a really important one, the question of shipbreaking. Last year, 630 ocean-going vessels, about 90% of the gross tonnage dismantled globally, were broken down on 3 beaches in South Asia. This dangerous and intense work carries important lessons for how the design and construction industry might approach disassembly and offer opportunities for reuse and recycling. Today, we will hear what both industries might learn from each other. We are so honored to have Nicola Mulinaris here from the NGO Shipbreaking Platform lead our conversation. His focus is on legal and policy work, as well as communications. In 2019, he received the Public Eye Investigation Award for his research in shipbreaking. He joins us from his office in Brussels. Nicola will be in conversation with David Johnson, a principal at Sarah Architects. He's an internationally recognized leader in applications of the circular economy and regenerative principles in the built environment. He's an expert. Nicola and David, we're so glad you've both joined us. Nicola, I think you're going to get us started.
Hello, everyone. Thank you once again for this invitation and giving me and the NGO Shipbreaking Platform the opportunity to talk about today's topic. I would like to start off showing a short video that was published recently on YouTube and by Business Insider that I hope can give everyone a brief overview of what we're talking about today.
For these $300 million cruise ships, this is the end of the line.
Hoş geldiniz.
Because of the pandemic, Carnival, Costa, and Pullmantur cruise lines have all sent ships to Western Turkey for demolition. Here, they'll be ripped to shreds deck by deck and sold for parts.
Yani geminin diyebilirim ki tamamını geri dönüştürüyoruz diyebilirim.
But dismantling a ship that holds 2,000 passengers, well, that's
one of the most dangerous jobs in the world.
Shipbreakers saw off massive sections of the hull and moved them overhead. There's millions of dollars worth of parts at stake, but any misstep could mean injury or hurting the environment. And it's only gotten harder, with lots of new arrivals. We take you inside the yard, turning these floating hotels into this. Before the pandemic, the Aliaga shipbreaking yards were pretty quiet. Normally, the 22 yards only demolished a few dozen cargo ships a year. But when the pandemic wrecked the cruising industry, more and more cruise ships ended up here. After losing more than $4 billion in the second quarter of 2020, Carnival Cruise Line decided it was more affordable to sell its old ships for parts than try to keep them operating. Aliaga will be the last stop for Carnival's inspiration, imagination, and fantasy ships.
Şu arkamda görmüş olduğunuz kruz gemileri özellikle belki bir 5 yıl 10 yıl daha kadar çalışabilirdi. Yaklaşık 5 yıl 10 yıl daha çalışabilecek durumda olan gemilerini Aliaga'ya gönderdiler.
Captains navigate the cruise liners from the US, UK, and Italy. They coordinate with the harbor master to beach ships.
Then the bow front of the vessel is grounded on the shore while the stern is still afloat.
We plan how we cut the vessels together with our technical department.
Then 2,500 shipbreakers set out to remove any valuable material.
There are very expensive navigational equipments at bridge side.
Working one deck at a time, crews take out all the furniture, mostly by hand. We're talking everything from chairs, tables, and pianos, to light fixtures and beds.
I can easily say that cruise vessels are the hardest vessel type to dismantle because, there are hundreds of rooms on board.
Then they move on to amenities, dismantling gyms, pools, and theaters. Stripping walls, windows, floors, and handrails is next. This is where lots of saws and blowtorches come in.
Workers risk daily falling from great heights, inhaling toxic gases during cutting operations, being hit by falling objects, and the blowtorch comes with fire hazards.
They are working in very high degrees under the sun in summer times, or they are working in very extreme conditions in winter time. Bu iş ILO'yu biliyorsunuz. ILO'nun listesine göre dünyanın en zorlu işi.
Since October 2020, 2 workers have died from falling objects.
The vessel lies on water, so there is no any way for the ambulance to reach in case of emergency situations.
Despite these injuries, working conditions in Aliaga are better than those of the world's biggest shipbreaking yards.
In South Asia, in Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, where most of the end-of-life vessels end up every year. Dozens of people die or get injured in the process.
Those yards in South Asia use the dangerous gravity method.
That is dropping huge blocks into the water onto the beach.
But in Turkey, workers lift ship parts with a massive crane.
Which has a 2,000-ton capacity in our shore side, and we cut big blocks at the vessel, and by using this huge crane, we take these big blocks at our secondary cutting zone.
Aliaga hasn't always had the safest yards. In the late 90s, Turkey was just as bad as South Asia. But in 2002, Greenpeace released a report that revealed the unsafe work conditions here, and the world took notice.
As a reaction to this international criticism, things have improved considerably.
Things got even safer in 2018, when some Aliaga yards started complying with the European Union shipbreaking regulation. That's why Carnival chose 2 yards here for its end-of-life ships.
8 tane firma Avrupa Birliği kriterleriyle ilgili sertifika lisansları var bunların.
Those EU guidelines have also raised the standards for environmental practices. Every cruise ship has dozens of toxins hidden inside. Things like asbestos in pipes, heavy metals in paints, biological hazards from sewage tanks, radioactive material from gauges, and the list goes on. Left unchecked, they can seep into the soil, beach, and water, where they've destroyed local marine habitats and water systems around shipbreaking yards before. But because of these new regulations, Aliaga got newer and better drainage systems and cement floors in the secondary cutting area, so workers weren't cutting ship parts on open beach. They also got new oil booms for containing oil spills, a new waste management center for properly disposing of those toxins in the ship, and a better asbestos removal process.
Practices have been improved, but there are still concerns related to the long-term impact on the health of the workers due to exposure to toxic substances.
Nicola says many workers aren't aware of these risks, and the rest choose the job anyway because of the high pay.
Şu anda gemi söküm çalışan normal işçi abilerimizin almış olduğu ücretler yaklaşık $1.500 seviyesinde ve bu da ciddi bir rakama tekabül ediyor Türkiye şartlarında. Eğitim yönünden çok fazla kendini geliştirme fırsatı bulamamış abilerin alabileceği gerçekten ciddi bir rakam.
After the ship is demolished, this is all that's left. While the whole process takes 6 months for a cargo ship, it takes a lot longer for a cruise ship.
Almost 1 year, maybe more.
Workers move everything pulled off the ships into separate piles. Electronics, light fixtures, textiles, furniture, glass, and machinery.
Tabii diğer yolcu gemilerden çıkan ahşaptır, koltuktur, mutfak malzemeleridir. Bunlar da tekrar geri dönüştürülüyor. Kafeler, restoranlar, oteller.
Buyers interested in cruise memorabilia claim the life jackets, art, and maps from antique sellers. But what about all that metal?
Şimdi tabii bu gemiler burada sökülüyor. Sökülürken de bu malzemeler yeni Foça'da bunların tamamı burada kesilen demir metal kısmı tekrar geri dönüştürülüp inşaat demiri vesaire demiri malzeme haline geliyor.
In 2020, OMIL estimates workers pulled over 1 million tons of steel off cruise ships here, and that'll all be recycled.
Recycling steel instead of mining the raw materials reduces definitely energy requirements and the carbon footprint.
Bu demiri madenlerden çıkartmak için mesela şu arkamda gördüğünüz gemi yaklaşık 30.000 ton. 30.000 ton demiri madenden çıkartmak için ne kadar büyük bir insan gücü, ne kadar büyük bir ticari yatırım gerektirdiğini düşünürsek bunun çöpe gitmesi ya da hani yok olup heba olup gitmesi dense biz burada onları alıp tekrar ekonomiye kazandırıyoruz.
It's estimated scrap metal from one ship could pull in around $4 million in profit for the Shipbreaking Association.
You can make good money because there are lots of things on board for second-hand sales.
Demolishing these bigger ships has led to larger profits and a growing workforce for Aliaga shipyards.
Sadece de pandemiden sonra kruz gemilerinin buraya gelip bizim kapasitemize %30 bir artış sağladı.
But as shipbreaking booms, it comes on the heels of a crumbling cruise industry.
The video that you just watched offers an overview of the main risks related to that workers face during dismantling operation at these shipyards. Let's once again keep in mind that those images are mainly related to the operations at Aliağa in Turkey, where environmental and social conditions are far from ideal, but are way better than most of the places where the majority of the end-of-life fleet ends up every year. As rightly pointed out by Margie before, 90% of the gross tonnage every year ends up in Bangladesh, India and Pakistan, being broken under dirty and dangerous conditions on beaches. Shipbreaking on South Asian beaches is inevitably linked to pollution and environmental degradation, hazardous labor conditions, dumping of waste, fraud, lack of transparency, child labor. And we have to highlight the fact that shipping companies and the intermediaries via whom the shipping companies are selling these ships to the scrapping yards are making millions of dollars of profits thanks to these end-of-life toxic sales to substandard yards. These shipping companies that, as you can see from this infographic, are mainly located in the global north, can be truly be considered as exporters of pollution and social injustice. If we are talking about the activities that we carry out as NGO Shipbreaking Platform, well, we definitely do a lot of advocacy and lobby work at regional, international, and national level to push for better, clean, safe ship recycling practices and fight against dirty and dangerous ones. We do also do a lot of research work and collect data on the whole sector. In the last decades, at least 7,000 vessels were sold to South Asian shipbreaking yards for dirty and dangerous scrapping. In the process, in the cutting process of these vessels, 425 workers at least lost their lives, and 329 workers were severely injured. This is a picture of a worker that suffered burns, severe burns on 90% of his body following a gas cylinder explosion at a yard back in 2016 in Bangladesh. His name is Sheju. He was lucky. His co-workers died and he survived. This is another picture of the biggest accident and tragedy in shipbreaking history. Dates back to the 1st of November 2016 in Gadani, Pakistan, when there was a massive explosion on a tanker that was beached. At least 29 workers lost their lives and more than 60 workers got severely injured. And it took several days for the Pakistani fire brigade to extinguish the flames. Yes, if we zoom out for a minute, I guess we can acknowledge the fact that all this is possible due to the fact that our modern world is ruled by a subverted model of circular economy. Why? Because we keep ignoring the two major pillars of a truly circular economy. Natural capital. We keep overproducing and over-consuming goods and products, no matter how useless or toxic they are. We also keep ignoring the second pillar, cost internalization. We ignore that the history of humanity is a history of cost externalization at the expenses of vulnerable communities and the environment. The waste sector, in particular, the toxic waste sector, offers perfect examples. I mean, as human beings, we succeeded in the last centuries in creating many pollution heavens, if you want to call them that way, strategically located in the global south. Waste can definitely be an opportunity. I mean, recycling, reusing are all positive aspects of a circular economy. And the waste sector can offer jobs to less fortunate and poor communities and people. But waste can also easily become a threat if not handled in a proper way. And this toxic trade is often sold as beneficial for, let's say, the vulnerable countries. It's sold as economic development, even though it mainly benefits the rich ones. When we talk about toxic trade, we talk again about weak governance, poverty, lack of resources, cheap labor, economic dependence. And big examples are the electronic waste dumps that are currently located in Ghana and in China. Examples of toxic trade, if you want a new form of colonialism, toxic colonialism, are the chemical waste dumping cases that took place in West Africa in the past, the Cocoa case in the end of the 80s, and the Trafigura case in 2006. And an example of toxic trade is definitely shipbreaking in South Asia. There is definitely a pressing need for shifting from pollution to solutions. There is a pressing need for a radical improvement of ship recycling operations, an improvement that has to focus on the end of life phase. And this is, for instance, a curious fact. I guess for a radical improvement, which focuses on an end of life phase, we have just to go back to the future, because back in 1999, actually, a Japanese investor built 4 dry docks, a state-of-the-art facility to scrap ships less than 100 kilometers away from the Indian beach of Alang, with the capacity to recycle 1 million light displacement tons annually. The curious fact is that the facility was forced, unfortunately, to convert to building and repair because the beaching yards in Alang were not closed down, and because ship owners kept opting for, let's say, top dollar options offered by the yards located on the beach. Of course, it's not enough to focus and, let's say, to go back to the future and start using already available technologies related to the end of life phase. We need to start focusing on value retention, material recovery, meaningful next use already at an earlier stage, already during the design phase. I don't want to take, say, more time right now, because I think there will be an opportunity later on for me during the chat with David to elaborate more on the challenges and opportunities related to closed loop ship life cycle approach, and on lessons that can be learned from other sectors, such as the automotive sector and the building sector. I now leave the floor to David, who will surely offer a brilliant perspective on the latter.
Nicola, that was fabulous. I think the building industry needs to understand that we own much of the problem that you just outlined because of the amount of building goods that get shipped across the world in those very ships. So we shouldn't be thinking of this as two separate discussions. It's really one, and it's going to be amazing, I think, how this discussion comes together. With modern life came the ability to manufacture consumer goods at a pace unseen before, and we still now continue with those practices of that extractive economy leading to waste. The building industry looks like it is high tech, and it's putting together things with precision and care, but in fact, we know that there's that the disassembly of buildings is currently a very messy task. So how big of a problem are we looking at? Plastics are becoming more common. We know that the plastic bottle gets a lot of attention, but 91% of plastics is not recycled, and 80% of e-waste is not recovered and recycled. The plastic story is pretty sad. We see that the amount of leakage, this is a flow diagram for the plastics of the world, that the leakage into the environment is about 32%, 40% going into landfill, 14% being incinerated. 40% of all food produced in the US is thrown out. Clothing is worn half as long as it was 10 years ago. This is a one. This must be out of date. 60% of office space is unused, including the work hours. And cars spend 92% of its life parked. There's got to be smarter ways. What we learned in 2020 is that we are now at a point where the anthropogenic mass that we have produced on the earth is equal to the biomass of the earth. And in the years to come, the goods that we have manufactured will be exceeding the biomass of the planet. This from Nature magazine. Between now, this stat is now a few years old, but it still holds true. Between now and 2050, we expect to build 2.5 trillion square feet of new construction. This is the urbanization of our cities, adding the equivalent of one New York City to the planet every month for the next 40 years. And the construction industry, waste currently is in the US is double the amount of the waste that's thrown into household trash bins. Globally, we're on this chart shows the recovery rate on the left and the construction debris on the bottom per capita. So you see where the US is relative to other countries. Nicola, I was interested to see the poor performers there in China, Brazil, India. The United States produces a lot per capita, but we recover more. France is an interesting outlier there, producing more per capita and recovering less than others. So it's a global problem. In the US, a lot of my attention has been drawn recently to the flow of commercial interiors. So about 32 million tons a year of commercial waste is produced by improving our office space. Green here is the commercial sector, and gray is the residential sector, but it's that 20% of the total C&D waste, construction and demolition waste, comes from improving our office spaces. Copper is an interesting story. We now globally produce 20 million tons of copper a year. And copper continues to become more valuable. It's documented that there's now more copper in the built environment than has been identified as resources to be mined from the planet. So this paradigm of urban mining is something that we should all be looking at. Gypsum board is an interesting story. It doesn't do well in landfill, but it is a product from construction that can be harvested and put back into gypsum board if it has the right integrity, or it can be a soil amendment or used for composting. So gypsum board might be an example of a resource that can be improved upon. But those are end of the pipe situations. On the production side, we're seeing more and more the water sources for cities are contaminated from the manufacturing. This case, 1,400 households continue now to be forced to consume their water from bottled sources because their well water and the city water is contaminated. And one of the leading contamination sources right now is PFAS. And I was delighted to see that the EPA now is instituting a program to change the way that PFAS is governed in the built environment. So this came out from The Guardian just last week, I think, that the EPA identified 120,000 facilities that expose people to PFAS, indicated as the red dots on the map. PFAS is ubiquitous. When the EPA was trying to source blood samples that were not contaminated by PFAS, so they could have a baseline of what uncontaminated blood looks like, they were not able to find a human living blood sample that did not have PFAS. They had to go to samples that were stored from the Korean War from vets to find samples that were not contaminated with PFAS. There's 5,000 types of PFAS and only 30 can be tested for right now. I was able to be an advisor to an important body of work by the Green Science Policy Institute, where they are identifying for architects where PFAS is in the buildings that we build. One of the surprises for me from this research was that PFAS is commonly included as a coating on new glass assemblies. So it's put on the outside of the glass so that during the warranty period, the glass will stay cleaner and shed dirt. But of course, as the glass is exposed to UV degradation, heat cycles, the PFAS sloughs off and then actually produces little ridges that attract more dirt and contamination to the glass, making it look dirty. So they scrub it harder, and then the PFAS goes into the environment. PFAS are called forever chemicals because they don't go away and they bioaccumulate in our children. Design for disassembly it leads towards one of the answers. And can we design products out of materials that have the integrity and quality that we want? And do we design them in such a way so that they can be disassembled? This project by McDonough called Sustainability Base is one of the few examples of buildings that are built that way. But it's a design. This starts kind of a list of design opportunities of how can we design for the recovery of the materials. Buildings as material banks is an initiative that the EU generously funded for the world that defined a methodology to create passports for materials that would then be built and used in a way that they could be reclaimed and reused, and so that passport is a living material. And I know Nicola and I have talked about the use of passports in the shipping industry as well, to varying degrees of success. Cities around the world are identifying ways that they can use policy to create change. So the city of San Francisco here has a very strong recycling program, but they've tried to identify where are the levers of change in the cycle of materials, and where can they institute policy, whether it's policy about design for disassembly or deconstruction or urban mining, starting with the city's own buildings and starting probably with tenant improvements and material projects that have material flows that move quickly. How can surplus materials be recovered? There's a number of mapping initiatives that are nascent right now in the industry. Some get a lot of traction right now. So this is one example of a mapping system where materials that are available for reuse and companies that want materials but don't necessarily need them to be new come together with a map of resources to explain that. Imagine, Nicola, if we were able to have a feedback loop between the shipping materials and the people that need the steel, and that could be mapped. There's companies that are being created around recovery as a business model to repurpose and recycle, especially in those office interiors. All for Reuse is a very strong program that is seeking to reuse materials between the public and the private sector and governmental agencies, and designed for long and gentle use of materials. Their goals are to reduce waste and emissions and foster new circular economy business and accelerate the rate of change. They're taking a systems approach, which I think is interesting. Build reuse is another example in the US, where materials that are suitable for reuse are cataloged and shared in a network. And one program that I'm really excited about right now is a cloud-based software called Matter, coming out of a company called Giga. Now, because as Nicola suggested, there's a number of criteria that are beginning to compete. We now have an interest, obviously an interest, to reduce the embodied carbon footprint. We also need to be understanding opportunities for circularity and issues in the ecology, safety, social, and health. And how does an architect or specifier or contractor understand all these different programs to create, to make a choice? And I think one of the aspects that's going to become stronger in the future is the need to provide the granularity of data for companies responsible to ESG commitments. So I think that initiatives like this that are cloud-based, that produce that granularity of data, is going to have promise. I can't share the work of the group, but I was lucky enough to be part of a working group by the Healthy Product Declaration Collaborative. Most people in the industry know what an HPD is, and HPDC is looking at adding a social equity aspect to their label. Look for more of that next year, I hope. I'll give a little bit of a hint, is that the location of the manufacturer and the location of the end of use is maybe the greatest indicator of social equity in products in the built environment. I put a lot of faith in the circular economy, but it still needs to focus more on quality rather than quantity. But this is something that I was really excited to share, this concept of a product circularity data sheet that's coming out of Luxembourg. And this will most likely become an ISO standard in the very near future. This is the state of the art for how do we understand the circularity of a product. And what they're looking at is these 5 aspects: the general information about the material, it's important; what the composition is, giving preference to products that have post-consumer recycled by weight; designed for better use, that can be maintained and repaired to extend use; designed for disassembly, so the materials can be recovered, and then designed for reuse. And all of this is put into an ISO standard. So it's these PCDS, it's going to be a new acronym for us, I hope, is something that the producer would require from their suppliers of products that may be made out of components from other manufacturers. And then that is then put in through the distribution chain, put into a building, and then recovered. But what's interesting about the PCDS is it's designed to create that dialogue between the different players in our ecosystem, so that we can feed information forward that there's going to be material available, and we can understand where materials came from and their provenance. I'm a hopeful person. I really believe that we are in a transition right now, framed by the UN SDGs. We're in a transition from a wasteful, unjust, degenerative, extractive economy to a regenerative economy. And sustainability right now is not going to be enough to map our future. And I think you could take this diagram and look back towards practices that are purely extractive and the failure that they have led toward, and how we need to frame our decisions in the future toward a regenerative economy in multiple dimensions. And I'm a believer that it's a complicated system. I came across this map by Race to Zero, and it showed to me in one place the complexity of our ecosystem and the role that each one of these has and the levers that each one has, the importance of finance there, that band in the middle, as a controlling force, the power of policy at the beginning, the roles and the actors in the built environment, and then the value chain of all the materials that feed into those. So it's not enough to just address the materials at the end of the pipe. We need to understand the broad ecosystem so that the value chain of materials can be retained and improved through our practices. And each one of these players has a role. So just finishing up, what we need, these slides from my friends at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, we need to design out waste and pollution. We need to keep products and materials in use for longer, gentle use. And we need to regenerate natural systems in the decisions that we use going forward. Thank you. I'm looking forward to our chat.
Great. So thank you both for that amazing, for each of your very different, amazing presentations. So I guess I would ask you, Nicola, what questions do you have for Dave about what the shipbreaking industry could learn from his presentation? And then I'm going to ask Dave to respond about what Nicola said that we could take as learnings for our industry. Nicola?
Thank you. Well, I think David shared a number of very interesting initiatives, programs, and approaches that can offer a valuable lesson for ship recycling. And I must say that as it is now, the shipping sector and the ship recycling, there is no real link between design and end-of-life phase. Hence, we need absolutely to learn lessons from other sectors. Why? Well, there are, I would say, embedded challenges within the whole ship recycling system currently, because the remanufacturing rate is extremely low. The supply chain linked to the sector is way too large. Ships have a quite long operational life, and there are constant technological developments that make components easily outdated. With time, laws and regulation are not yet really taking into account proper reuse rates, and reuse was definitely a concept and a keyword that showed up a lot in the presentation. And there is a general lack of awareness and transparency on basically the inventory of hazardous and non-hazardous materials that are on board these ships. There is no wide use of standardized components. So I believe from my point of view, the ship recycling industry can learn a lot from other sectors than, let's say, the other way around. But please give me and give us your opinion on this.
I was exposed early on years ago, I think we shared this in an earlier conversation, to some of the work done in the shipping industry on a materials passport. And it was some early and fundamental work that this term of a passport has been used more and more in the last decade. This idea that we catalog what a material is or a product is, and that it goes into use and we know where it's going to go and it retains value. Buildings as material banks has been a design paradigm for developments in Europe to prove and to benefit in the financing that projects that are designed for reuse retain a higher value at the end of the use period. But can you just reflect on why material passports have not become a common method in the shipping industry to help address some of these concerns, or has it become one?
Well, I guess you are partially or fully referring to some initiatives that took place a few years ago. For instance, this cradle-to-cradle passport that was elaborated by shipping company, one of the biggest container shipping company, Danish one, Maersk. And I mean, it was definitely a valuable and interesting concept. As you say, try to basically map the materials that are used, and at the end of the life, basically take these materials or part of them and then reuse them for new builds. Unfortunately, and that's again, I mean, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I see in a way that this cradle-to-cradle passport project of specifically Maersk in a way got beached and got scrapped. Maersk, unfortunately, decided to scrap again ships on beaches, and this massive U-turn took place in 2015 or 2016. So, I mean, quite recently. And I don't see how, a cradle-to-cradle passport concept is coherent with, yes, a circular economy, because let's not forget it also in South Asia, like a lot of materials are reused and recycled, but a circular economy model that again is subverted because it's based on cost externalities and is based on using a method that is absolutely considered by several experts as the worst possible recycling methods. And I mean, scrapping a ship on a tidal mudflat where there's a tide coming in twice a day, I mean, that's definitely not the safest way to do this. So I believe it's important to, let's say, make this cradle-to-cradle passport flourish and grow in, let's say, closed-loop circular economy hubs, where it's possible to track and trace basically where these materials end up, and it's possible to basically recover these materials and use them for new builds within the same company.
That's cool.
Nicola, one question that comes up is in the San Francisco Bay Area and in many other urban centers around the world on the water, there's extreme housing shortages. And so why would a cruise ship owner decide to recycle their ship as opposed to potentially repurpose it for some other hoteling type option or something like that, which sort of, presupposes, going forward to recycling it? Why can't it just be reused for another, perhaps non-transportative use?
Yeah, well, let's say that the COVID pandemic, in a way, shifted a bit the whole market, and let's say changed it completely, in the sense that normally after, let's say, several decades, most cruise ships do not go to scrap or for scrapping like, let's say, other types of vessels, such as container ships or tankers, etc. But they're normally sold to secondary, let's say, second-hand markets to serve in smaller shipping routes. Due to COVID, a lot of cruise shipping companies, realized that keeping these assets operational, at a pier just stuck there, not traveling the world was definitely costly, and there was absolutely no second-hand market available because all the cruise shipping companies in the world, the small and the big ones, were in a crisis. So then there was no other option for these shipping companies than to scrap these assets, even though they were relatively young. Of course, we hear a lot like, using ships as accommodation. I mean, not only, for countries where there's a shortage in terms of housing, but also I heard, this type of, let's say, idea linked to the migration crisis, for instance, that they were witnessing in the Mediterranean area. And there are, of course, as you know, projects like museums, hotel, casinos, like that are built and functioning on ships that are still afloat and serve as accommodation or, let's say, venue. But I believe it's much more a question of like the cost that, keeping these assets afloat would entail. And again, for a lot of owners, it might be easier to find a buyer that wants to scrap these ships rather than turning into, let's say, an accommodation project. In the end of the day, especially in certain moments of history, certain dynamics in the shipping markets will change dynamics also in the scrapping market. And sometimes what are the, let's say, the demolition rates that are offered by certain shipbreaking yards in certain parts of the world, let's say, are quite tempting for shipping companies that are in need or willing to cash in.
Nicola, I've got a question. It seems like there's one key difference between the two industries is the construction industry is distributed more uniformly around the world. And certainly in the urban cities, there's more activity than in the rural places. And from my point of view, getting standards to apply ubiquitously to this very diverse system is one of the inherent problems. From my perspective, it seems like the shipping industry, where the ships are produced and the number of companies that produce the ships and where the ships are disassembled, that the number of players is more finite. Is there, and I remember you telling me that a lot of the flags of the ships are changed in a very few number of small, economically challenged island countries. But is that difference of the number of stakeholders and players and actors, is there an opportunity for the shipping industry to act in a way that the building industry is unable to?
Well, that's definitely loaded and interesting question. I mean, indeed, there's currently no geographical balance, if you want to call it that way, when we talk about shipbuilding, which is mainly concentrated in Asia and East Asia, and shipbreaking, which is mainly concentrated in South Asia. I think the numbers of players involved in this, let's say, two interlinked sectors is indeed quite limited. But right now, the old system, especially when we talk about the end-of-life phase, which is anyway my field of specialization, I mean, is unfortunately based on a system that thrives thanks to lack of transparency and secrecy and dodgy deals. At the end of the day, you mentioned the use of gray and blacklisted, poorly performing flags of convenience, the use of post boxes in, let's say, brass plate companies in tax havens. I mean, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but you know, these are not, let's say, the solid grounds and the solid foundations on which I would build change. And you know, I might sound pessimistic, but at the same time, I'm also optimistic because I think that there are massive changes in the future coming. Thanks to a lot of policy and legal initiatives that some of them, you definitely mentioned them in your presentation, but also, let's say, the one related to circular economy, related to waste exports, and ship recycling related to the Green Deal here in Europe, which stresses the importance of circularity and green jobs. And whilst I stated that, you know, maybe the ship recycling industry can learn a lot from the building sector, but rather not the other way around. But definitely there is a link, let's say, that goes both ways between the two sectors. And let's, for example, think about the secondary materials that come out of ship recycling that can be useful for the building sector. Let's think about secondary high-grade zero-emission steel that is generated via the cutting process of these massive end-of-life commercial vessels. And there is definitely, in my opinion, this big room to introduce environmental and social standards in public procurement that is linked to building and construction sector. And I mean, it's proven that using steel scrap in the production process reduces the, let's say, environmental impact. However, and this, you know, you might have to correct me if I'm wrong, but I also believe that still it's necessary to grow and to develop within this reuse and recycling of secondary steel, because a lot of steel applications, such as in car manufacturing and structural elements in buildings, have low tolerances for copper content. And also recycling ships has to come with circular by design approaches and a better scrap sorting process, unless this really concept of circularity will not really come into light. Am I wrong to, let's say, mention, let's say, the copper, let's say, contamination when it comes also to the building sector that is challenging? And
so we have a question from Zig Rubel.
Can you hear me?
Yes, there we are.
All right, great presentation. I was just curious, assuming everyone who's on the call today is a believer and interested in sharing knowledge, my question is, what do you think we need to tell the incumbents in the different industries, so the naval architects of the world, or the shipbuilders, and the building architects of the world, and the general contractors, to start paying attention what the other people are doing? What do you think a common message might need to be more curious?
I think the common language, this language that we're inventing right now of a regenerative economy, and the tactics and the strategies that we're going to need to change that, is going to be one of our challenges, is that we're still inventing the language in European economies. It's called the taxonomy in the carbon markets, and then educating broadly people on a common set of principles, goals, and strategies, so that we can collectively be acting in unison, is going to be another aspect. I think there's but we don't have to look at the entire industries all at one time. And Nicola just brought up copper contamination in steel, and there may be portions of these markets that we can focus on as levers. Perhaps if we just try to institute higher degree of material intelligence around steel, and we just sought successes in steel. Imagine the wins that we could have, that we could learn from, and then propagate that into aluminum and copper and furnishings and fixtures and all kinds of other things. But maybe we just need to start at a place that has ground, and look at all the players and actors and get a common language and a common set of approaches, principles, and strategies, so we can act more in unison. Nicola, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I guess I couldn't say it better than David. I mean, just to add on that, I think, Zygmunt, you mentioned naval architects and building architects. And again, in order to act at unison, you need to understand, let's say, the common grounds. And I think, as I mentioned, this flow or potentially useful secondary materials that are useful for one sector, the building sector, coming out of the recycling one. I mean, that's definitely a common ground, and a lot of, let's say, game-changing conversation should start there. And of course, it's not only, a conversation that should be limited to the naval architect and the building architect. Yes, we're talking about the design phase, but we should involve all stakeholders in the whole supply chain. And in some of the, one very interesting slide that David shows, I mean, we saw also the massive role financial institutions have to play. And also, let's not forget, like these, let's say, creative hubs that academia and like universities are. There are several projects right now that are ongoing. For instance, one in Germany that is looking how to basically better design, let's say, accommodation sections in cruise ships, taking into account the end of life phase. And this can be a a learning opportunity, of course, for both sectors, and an opportunity for cooperation.
There's a piggyback that Yanni asked a question about what are some of the incentive structures for specifiers and builders to adopt these methodologies and champion sustainable practices and materials. And it kind of goes back, it kind of relates to what you were just talking about, Nicola, is that their policy, well, there's 4 ways that I think there are incentive structures right now. The first one might be the oldest, and that's this ground up innovation of designing for disassembly and having a financial incentive in the capital markets for doing so. And so there's projects in Europe that have successfully improved their financial situation with their debt by designing entire districts using design for disassembly protocols to reduce the exposure. So that's one. Cities like San Francisco are looking at, and many cities are looking at policies that would incentivize development by adding area, expediting review time, if they adopt these strategies. And then ESG is becoming more and more important. I feel like a broken record on ESG, is that the capital markets now, especially in the construction industry, CBRE just came out with a wonderful 12-page deck on ESG in the construction industry. But projects are going to be evaluated for finance based on their ESG properties, and material use is going to be a big part of it. So I'll just stop there. Those are some of the ways that there are incentives now and those incentives are growing. Sorry if I talked too long there.
Not at all. We have one last question from Kareem Tahawi. Kareem, are you with us?
Yep, I'm here. Hi, thank you very much. Super interesting. Just a follow up on that incentives question, which is who in the value chain has that responsibility, both for sort of the input side, construction, and the sort of outside demo side? And can we learn anything from shipbuilding in terms of incentives?
Nicola, that might be one for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way to push for change, we can talk about incentives and, let's say, money like flowing in companies incentivizing the use of, let's say, more sustainable material, standardized, let's say, elements. However, another way to push for change, and you asked about responsibility, also lies in the hands of governments, and I'm talking about international bodies and regional regulatory bodies. So if we, for example, consider legislation that is applicable to ship recycling, well, there are references there to the shipbuilding as well. So there's definitely already a link in legislation focused on end-of-life phase to the initial design and planning phase. And that's, I think, definitely a way that will put responsibility also in the hands of builders and also recyclers and all actors involved in both sectors. So I think there's like a couple of elements and factors can play an important role in shifting towards better practices. On the one hand, let's say the carrots, let's say incentives. On the other hand, let's say the stick. So basically regulation and mandatory rules.
How do we internalize? How do we internalize those externalities? That'd be a whole nother talk.
Well, you've given us a great idea for our next conversation, Dave. Dave, Nicola, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your thoughtful provocations to all of us in the field. We can't thank you enough for your time. And Nicola, I know it was a bit of a leap for you to engage in this conversation with an expert like Dave, and you rocked it. Thank you so much. And Dave, always so wonderful to get to work with you. So with that, this concludes CIDCI's online salon. This session will be recorded and placed on the CIDCI website and YouTube. YouTube as soon as possible. To join us for future webinars, be sure to subscribe to our newsletter on our website, CIDCI.org. Please join us for our next webinar on November 5 at 8 a.m. as we explore innovations in color and light. Special thanks to Katie Olson for keeping us on track and our sponsors who make all of this possible. Thanks for joining us. And as always, if you have thoughts or comments, please reach out to us via CIDCI's website, contact us link. Thank you so much. Be safe.